Greetings all, and welcome to another session here of Tuzi Talks as we continue our discussion in second language acquisition. Today we're going to be looking at input and interaction in second language learning. We'll begin by just doing a little introduction of some of the things that we're going to cover. We'll talk a little bit about Krashen's input hypothesis, and then we'll look at some other hypotheses like the interaction hypothesis, output hypothesis, input processing, and following. We'll also summarize with how some of these things are working in regard to language learning today. Let's all just jump into the introduction here. We're going to be looking at second language learning from a more social perspective. In my earlier videos, we talked a little bit more about the science, the harder science of it, what's going on in the brain, the linguistic element of it, the syntactical, the image processing that's going on with merely processing the information. This video is going to be a little bit more about the social interaction and that element, that component that's required for language learning. So we'll look at the role of the environment in second language learning. Again, we'll look at some of Krashen's stuff and the interaction hypothesis with Long, and then Swain's output hypothesis. Those are the three main ones that we're going to be looking at. Bear in mind that Krashen was not only first, but it was based off of his publications that people began to do other types of research. In particular here would be Long and Swain. So all of these need to be taken into account when we look at this whole idea about second language learning and that process. Before we begin and jump into second language learning and those processes, it's always good to begin at our roots. And for anybody in second language acquisition, the primary data that we get, the foundational data, generally comes from first language research. So in this case, it's going to be first language acquisition. And where does first language acquisition begin? It begins when you're a little baby. Something that they would call baby talk. You know, when you see a little kid and someone starts talking like they've got no brains. Hello, little baby. And they use baby talk when they're talking with kids. And when the kid gets a little older and they can understand two-word sentences, right? Then you can start talking two-word sentences. But you have this little interaction that's going on. In the scientific literature, they call it child-directed speech. It's speech that's directed to the child and you talk to them. So that's the research that's been done, at least in first language. Most of this research has been done in English, and it's been primarily looking at a recast, where the child will say something and then you recast that back to them in more complete natural English, although not necessarily complete natural, but it's more complete than what the child might have. And so you're giving them some examples. You're helping, quote-unquote, helping them along. The other interesting thing about child-directed speech is that the purpose of doing it is not so that they can learn language. The purpose of doing it is so that you can communicate. You want to understand what they're saying. Or you want them to understand what you're saying, regardless. But the goal is communication, not language acquisition. So it's a little different there. The other thing that you should understand is that child-directed speech does not happen in every culture, in particular the English cultures that are all around the world. There are some cultures that speak to children directly, right, but when they're born. Some even before they're born, they're talking to the child in utero. Others don't talk to the child. They're not a communication partner until after they can communicate. And so there's a little difference that's going on there. It can't be everywhere. So it's not in every single culture. But children, in order for them to acquire language, have to be within groups where language is present. You can't just sit them in front of a TV and think that they're going to learn language. That's not going to happen. They need to be in interactional locations. Whether they're the ones actually interacting or not is going to be is different. Okay. Also, there are multidimensional models that are necessary. Parents need to, or caregivers need to communicate with their children, or at least be in an environment where their children are communicating. But children also have their own innate abilities. They have their innate skills. They have learning mechanisms, or in this case would be communication mechanisms, ways for them to learn. Not just language, but in anything. So there are multiple things that are going on there and that are required for language learning. What is clear is that the research on first language acquisition is insufficient. People are not actually trying to look at first language acquisition to see how children are actually learning. What are those components? There are some less focused, less research-oriented types of studies, observational types of studies that are out there. But there's more studies should be done with the detail of actually how language is actually being learned. Okay, there have been a lot of ideas that were out there in the 1970s and 80s. Then Krashen came out with a unified theory of language acquisition. And one of the most controversial elements would be Krashen's input hypothesis. I say controversial because there are people who were for it and people who were adamantly against it. The other parts of his five peg, five leg, five component theory, many of them were already accepted. He just reworded things that people had already spoken of before, like the affective filter. But let's look at the input hypothesis, since that's what we're going to be talking about for this lecture, this whole idea of input and interaction and then output. Humans acquire, says Krashen, language in only one way: by understanding messages, okay, received messages, or by receiving comprehensible input. So they're only getting input that's comprehensible. Okay, we move from I, our current level, to I plus 1, our current level plus a little more. And based on that current level plus a little more, we can acquire another language. There is no output that's required. There is no explanation that's required. You merely need input. And so basically you're learning your second language similar to the way that you learn first language. You don't need to focus on learning the grammar. You simply acquire it as you go, type of thing. Speaking results from acquisition. So after you acquire it, then you have the output. It's not the other way around. So says Krashen. Okay, so we have input, and eventually that becomes intake, and there's really nothing else that's involved. We have understanding the L2 from some sort of input, whether it's I or I plus 1. From what we take in, from the input that we hear, we notice a gap, and not we logically or consciously, subconsciously. We notice a gap between what our inner language is and what the system is, and then we try to adopt it so that that new information becomes our level. And that's the basic setup. I don't need to necessarily teach. I don't need to language in particular. I don't need to necessarily have a focus on the linguistic or the metalinguistic. Simply put them in an appropriate environment where they can get a little more than the level that they're in, and they will acquire language. That's basically the input element here for Krashen. Downside for his research. By the way, his research is extremely influential. There were school districts and some even states that had adopted his theories early on. However, there's little evidence to support his claims, and all that means is that we need people to do more research in that area. It would be nice to have it. There were also vague concepts, and these were people early on that were concerned. They made criticisms regarding that. I mean, how do you define what an appropriate level is, and what's I plus 1, what's a little more than what they need? And so there were some issues regarding it. There's also people who actually tried to implement his theories, and the results were less than satisfactory according to them. And you can go out and find articles related to them. The most noted that I can recall is an article entitled Crash and Burn, and you should be able to find that online somewhere. However, although Krashen's theory, especially in particular this input hypothesis, came under fire by some people, loved by others, it spurred on more research by other people. And Long's interaction hypothesis is a good example of this. So Long looked at what Krashen had said and said, this is a good base. I can see what's going on, but we need more description. We need more detail. We need more definition. And so Long began to do other research and actual research studies on this whole idea of input, and began to realize that input in a given social situation is going to spur on a variety of interaction. So he did a number of studies where you had native speakers and native speakers working and talking together, and what type of interaction did they have in order to get understood. They had mixed groups where they had native and non-native, and what kind of interactions did they have. And then they just had native speakers, two groups of native speakers working and talking together, and what type of interaction did they have. And he comes to the conclusion that interaction is going to be a vital part. So the three-step process here for Long is, one, you have linguistic or conversational adjustments promote comprehensible input. So you and I are talking and we're not quite understanding, so you ask a question, or you ask for clarification, or you say something, you ask a question, or you some type of thing, and we get this adjustment that's going on. and that's going to promote comprehensible input. Comprehensible input, according to Krashen and Long by this point, is going to promote acquisition, because we're going to force an understanding of a gap. And so therefore, linguistic and conversational adjustments actually promotes acquisition, because they begin to see and notice this thing, and then they can make a change. So we've got these 3 steps here, basically, is what we're looking at with Long as we walk through. To overcome these communication obstacles that 2 people or 2 groups have as they're communicating, regardless of whether they're both native speakers, they're mixed, or they're both non-native speakers. To overcome the communication obstacles, speakers used conversational tactics, okay? Ways to try to understand what's going on. They did things like repetition. They did confirmation checks, they did clarification questions, and so on, which brought about a negotiation of meaning, so that we could negotiate, okay, what exactly do you mean by this? And that brought about comprehension and then acquisition. Now, the researches that Long had done indicated that although it did happen many times, it didn't happen all the time. There were some groups that they had done studies in where there wasn't any acquisition. Later on, when they went to go back and study and retest them on the quote-unquote acquired language. But it did happen sometimes. And so, according to McKay, taking part in interaction can facilitate second language development. So he's not saying that it does, but he's saying it does help. That if you have this interaction, there's more of a likelihood. It's going to help you move along to acquire language. Personally, I enjoyed what Long had done simply because he had sat down and did the research. He did a variety of studies, not just Long, but also Ellis and others. So we have this interaction that's going on. Later on, as interaction had moved on and other people had critiqued and other people had done research, Long had gone in and done some rethinking about the interaction hypothesis. And so they began to recognize that there were limitations. Yes, you can have conversational tactics and you can have comprehension and then acquisition, but you're also going to have limitations based on the intake capability. You see, this little machine up here can do a lot of nice things, but it's limited in its capacity. And eventually it gets to overload. And I'm certain that you as a student of language or you as a teacher have at some point come to the realization that your brain's not going to be able to take anymore. You may be teaching a class and all of a sudden you realize all of these heads are now, they're all full. That little red button has popped out here and said, hey, we're done. And they're not going to get any more. So you switch gears or you leave class early or you do something else because their brains are full. They are at capacity. Just takes a while to process. That's the whole problem. The other thing is the focus ability. How long can you focus on a particular thing? Now, when you can focus on it, when your capacity is good, you're going to have better comprehension. Therefore, you're going to have better acquisition. So the key now is to bring this idea of negotiation of meaning, this interaction that goes back and forth, has to be done while there is sufficient capacity, intake capacity, and there's this ability to focus, to limit what's going on. And I'm glad that I see that happening. It's also good to see negative feedback, where you see someone saying, well, I think it's this way, or you see a correction, and that's a good thing, and you pull that correction and you can use it. Negative feedback is particularly more effective with things like morphology and vocabulary and syntax. Why? I don't know, but that's just simply what it was shown. This negative feedback. Okay, so Long does a lot of work based off of what Krashen had done. And then there was another person who came out, Swain, who brought out this whole idea about the need or importance or benefit, I guess would be the best word, of output in second language acquisition. Now, most researchers agree that output is necessary to increase fluency. Okay, it's all you do is study, that's all you do is have input. You're not going to be able to have the fluency to go out there and talk. Again, the best example I remember when I was living in Japan, there was this bilingual journalist that had gone out to Tokyo University to interview people in English. Because after all, they entered the most prestigious university in Japan. and they had to pass a rigorous language test, a rigorous English test. And they go and find these people, and the minute these people realize they're going to be on film, they run away. They passed the test, they made it into the school, but all they know is book knowledge. All they know is the study. They can take a sentence, a paragraph, and parse it, translate it into Japanese, but they cannot communicate. So these people run away. They haven't had the practice to do output. So most agree that output increases fluency. Swain goes a step further and says it does more. It modifies interlanguage. Okay. Again, the modifying of interlanguage is when you have this negotiation of meaning, when you have these conversational things and you get information back, and it can change what's going on in the brain, right? Noticing the gap that's there from what's out there and changing the rules in the interlanguage. Okay, I can see that. And so what Swain is saying is the mere output can do that. One thing that this could mean is that by simply speaking things, I'm also hearing it. I can notice a gap from what other people are saying and from what I'm saying. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you say something and after it comes out, you're like, that didn't sound right. Okay, you heard what you said and it didn't sound right, and so you corrected what you were saying. That idea is also encased in here. Other functions of output is consciousness raising. Noticing what I said versus what I know the rules are. What I said versus what he said, and I can compare the two and now say, that's not right. Hypothesis testing I can use. And I've done this as a language learner. I have an idea about how I want to say something in a particular language, and so I put it out there to see if I get it right. Of course, people look at me like, huh? I realize that my guess was wrong. My hypothesis was not right, and so I need to change something up. You can also do this whole idea of this metalinguistic analysis where you reflect on what you said, you hear what you said, you test what you said, you reevaluate, and you can review and do it again. What some researchers had decided to do was to encourage pushed output production. Get people to speak now so they can not only improve their fluency, but also get them to hear what they're saying and hear the differences. Starting to use the language is going to be a benefit to them because they can do more analysis of it. Now, there hasn't been much research in this area as well, and the research has been mixed. So we have this idea again, and we have people who should be going out and doing more research related to this area. In addition to these two theories, these two hypotheses, this interaction hypothesis and the output hypothesis, pushed output production as well, we have this whole area of feedback and recasts and negative evidence. Negative evidence in first language acquisition is rather interesting because it's available. You have things that can be used, it can be picked up by people sometimes, and so it's all there. However, we're not certain, we researchers are not certain that it's actually helpful with regard to language acquisition. How much is being in the environment simply going to be useful? How much are the innate capabilities useful? And then how much is the feedback, the recast, the social interaction component necessary for language acquisition? Unknown. In some mixed settings where you have native speakers and non-native speakers, there is some negative feedback that occurs, and it aids non-native speakers to speak more like native speakers. Okay, so when you get feedback and someone corrects pronunciation or they do a recast and you can pick up those, hey, it should be this way type of thing, you're going to help to sound more like a native speaker. And by the way, listening to feedback, listening to others is one of the best ways to notice those gaps and pronounce and speak a language faster. But you've got to notice. The point is, most people aren't noticing. Noticing whether, this is out of place or that is out of place, and looking at the language and so to hear these differences. I'm one who likes doing that. I love going to a foreign country or a different part of the country and hearing people pronounce things differently, and I want to copy that. It's just some of the things that I like to do. It's going to be better for me when I'm in that environment because I'm going to be listening not only for what other people are saying, but when they correct me, when they clarify for me and use it properly instead of me making the mistake. I'm going to notice that. I want to notice that, right? So that type of evidence is a good thing. Negative evidence in the second language classroom, recasts, which Yes, they're beneficial, especially for people who are more sensitive to being criticized. Okay, in some cultures, in more probably in someone with my type of personality, a teacher could look at me and say, "No, that's not the right way. Do it this way," and I'm going to take that. I'm going to accept and appropriate that and try to learn from that. Others are going to be more embarrassed or more offended or something, and so to keep that affective filter low enough so that they can acquire, recasts are more often used. More polite, more, it's nicer. Okay. Anyway, recasts are more effective with regard to phonology, right? So someone says woulda, right, and you say, "Oh, you mean water?" And then they can hear that difference phonologically, and they'll make changes more appropriately, more efficiently, and they'll remember it. Not always, mind you, but in the whole scheme of giving recasts, it's more effective in the area of phonology. The effective recast depends also on one's language ability. When I went to China, for example, and I tried to speak something in Chinese, and someone corrected me, I had no idea what they were doing. Because I only know a few words in Mandarin, and so even if they were correcting me, I don't get it. My language ability was way too low to even appreciate the recasts or the corrections that they were trying to give to me. So I need to have enough ability to not only understand but also appropriate these recasts. Maybe that you're just casting pearls before the swine in that case. So recasts are good, but make sure that they're going to be effective depending on the level of the students that you're dealing with. Okay, we have looked at the social interaction of things and how this social interaction can augment, whether it's straight input by Krashen, whether it's this interaction between groups, whether it's having some forced output within groups. Okay, but there's also now an attention to form based on this interaction, based on this social dynamic. Schmidt sought to identify the influence that input and interaction have on intake. Okay, and then intake, he's talking about the specific awareness to generic rules and generic ideas in language. And so he makes a distinction between noticing. Okay, noticing is when you're like, oh, hey, there's something there. I don't know what it is, but there's something there. And then there's the idea of understanding and awareness. Oh, here's this general rule now, and I want to try to apply it. I want to try to understand it. I can now see this general rule, and I want to start looking for ways that it's appropriate. Okay, so understanding or awareness is sort of a deeper level of noticing. You got noticing where you're like, hey, what, and that, what is that over there? And that's the noticing. That's being able to focus on that whatever in language. Okay, the understanding, the awareness is, okay, I know what that is. I may not be able to use it yet, but I know what that is, and I want to get ready to start using it. Okay, I don't know if you've had experiences like this when you're learning a second language. I have, where I'd sit down with a grammar book, a Japanese grammar book, by myself, and I would look at this structure, and I'd say, okay, I understand what this structure is now. Okay, and I would study it. Okay, and of course, you walk away, and then a couple minutes later, you're going to forget it. But then you study it one day, and you walk outside, and you hear somebody use that structure. And all of a sudden, it's not just noticing. All of a sudden, you're like, that's how it's used. And you hear what they're saying, and you can pick up what's going on there because you've gone beyond noticing. You begin to see how that general rule fits into the language. It's a very exciting thing when you can have that experience. Anyway, according to Schmidt, noticing is the necessary and sufficient condition for the conversion of input into intake. And these are two very important words in general philosophy. Necessary and sufficient. Necessary, you must have it. Sufficient, that's all you need. So it's a big thing for him to say this here, that noticing is all that you need. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it. I do know that it's necessary. I don't know that it's sufficient. It certainly does play a major role, and of course what Schmidt is trying to say here is beyond, after the noticing, you can't stop there. The noticing allows you to move on to the understanding. So noticing is sort of the gateway into deeper levels of understanding. You don't notice, you're not going to get anything. So you need to be able to do that. Attention to form. Attention to form with regard to feedback The recasts may be more effective as you're doing this, provided that the component that you're trying to focus on, the component that you're trying to give a recast on, is a major segment in the conversation, is a major segment in the input that you're receiving. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach a kid how to say a word properly, how to say whatever properly, and the kid is like, I'm not interested in that. It's not salient to them, even though, it may be part of the sentence that they just made. They're looking at the bigger picture. They're looking at this other major point, okay? So things need to be salient. They need to be important to what's being communicated so that it's going to be a stronger recast if something like that is included. If it's a minor thing, it's probably going to be less effective, that particular recast, okay? So in other words, be careful how you pick and choose the recasts that you care to put in. Okay, now there are some other theories related to these interactionist theories and the output hypothesis. The researchers that have been doing these types of studies, like Long and Swain, have also been they have been doing their primary work in the areas of modeling the linguistic and the psycholinguistic features of the things going on in the brain, how this process is working in reaction to the environment, in the reaction to what's going on with other people, with the environment that they're in. Okay, so that's what they're trying to look at now. Van Patten now takes some of these ideas with his theories of input processing. And his major focus is to try to explain how language learners get from the form that they pull out of input, okay, and how they can parse that form and get some comprehension out of it, okay. In other words, how does that whole process work? Someone says a phrase or something to me, and my brain has to process that. And I need to parse out what the structure is, what the meaning is, what the denotated meaning versus the connotated, so that I can understand what's going on, and all at the same time trying to have this negotiation of meaning. All at the same time trying to attend to what's the meaning of what's going on. Okay, so all this happens like this with us. We don't even think about it. I generally give an example of when I was in Japan. A friend came to visit me. We went out to eat, and we're sitting there talking. There's a TV behind my guests, and somebody makes a joke in Japanese, and I start laughing. I just thought I wasn't even paying attention to it, but the line came out, and I thought it was funny, and so I started laughing. And my guests are like, "What's so funny?" I had done the parsing, I had done all that stuff in my head and got the meaning out of it, and boom, it just came out, okay, without any attention to the linguistic parsing of what's going on. Well, Van Patten wants to know, what's that process? Okay, how does that work? What skills, what tricks, what things do we do to process that, and how we do it so quickly? Okay. The downside with the work that Van Patten was doing was that he was focusing on the shortcuts. He was focusing on those tricks, those strategies, those ways in which we do this, not necessarily on this big theory about how language is acquired, like Krashen did and like Swain and Long did in their later hypotheses. But to me, I find this interesting as well, this area of study. How do we get all this stuff going on while at the same time just attending to the meaning and the conversation and the communication that's going on? Last one that we're going to talk about is the autonomous induction or I-learning. Induction works in the opposite way that we normally do things with regard to language, right? In regard to language, we get the parsed information, we get the information, we try to parse it, we try to figure out what the components are and how it all fits together. Induction learning occurs in the opposite direction. When things don't process too very well, what we do is we learn by generalization, okay, by examples. And I don't know how many times I do this with vocabulary. Someone will say a word to me. Someone will be saying something, and this word comes out, and I don't know what it means. And so I first of all say, okay, well, what does it mean? I ask for a definition, and it's kind of like this. And they give me this information, and I still don't get it. And then I say, use it in a sentence. Give me an example of this word, this phrase, this idea in a sentence. Okay, what am I doing? Induction learning. This I learning. Okay, I turn everything over. Flip it upside down. Rather than try to figure out all the parts, use it in a sentence and help me to try to figure out what that is. Okay, this induction learning. It's an excellent way to learn. Again, it's not the standard way that most people learn language, by listening to examples. Okay, for most of us, we want to parse and break down and find the patterns first. If that doesn't work, okay, Carroll is saying flip it around, go the other way around. And I know I use this. I do this often when I'm trying to understand something. It is, for me, one of the later things that I will try to do, but I'm still trying to understand what's going on. I'm still trying to negotiate this meaning with that. All right, some quick summaries. Social linguists have paid much attention to the environmental factors that are involved, whether they are with regard to pressure or speed or the interaction between peoples, different genders, different cultures, all these things that are going on. They pay a lot of attention to those environmental factors. Now they're paying attention to information processing. Okay, how is this information processing between me and another person as we try to understand and communicate one another? Okay, people work for mutual understanding, and this I find amazing. No matter where you are, if you're trying to communicate, the goal here is that both of us try to understand. Put in a room two people from two different cultures who don't know each other's language, and for some reason they're going to want to try to do this. Both of us can try to understand, so we're working together for that. It's a neat thing to see. It is a social element. Next, negotiation involves linguistic and interactional changes. So we've got changes that's going on when we're doing this negotiation linguistically, but also within this interaction. There are changes that are occurring so that we can try to understand more and get to some agreed upon negotiated meaning. Okay? Focused feedback can aid in acquisition. Focused feedback, we talked about earlier with Recasts, at a certain time, at a certain place, with a certain level of student who can understand what those are, type of things. And so feedback can be useful provided on what it is you're doing feedback for, what area you're doing it for, and provided that the learner is ready to receive that particular feedback. That's all I have for this section here related to some of the other theories of second language learning. A little bit of Krashen's input hypothesis, but also Swain's Swain's output hypothesis, and also Long, Van Patten, and Carroll. Thank you for stopping by. And if you have any questions, you can certainly plop down some messages down here below, and if not, we'll talk to you later.